this would be a horrible talk. You know, there's a guy come in from England, and all he did was tell us about all horrible things that don't work in the world. So let me tell you about some things that do work in the world. But I want to preface it by saying the following. We haven't won the game of changing behaviors, not by any stretch of the imagination. So when I said that the social sciences are like chemistry was in the 1650s, I wasn't kidding. You know, my impression of the social sciences is we're still groping around. We need a certain amount of humility about what we find out in the social sciences. But there are some things we're learning, and it's something I call in the book neobehaviorism, ever, like most authors today, ever after the neologism, which makes you seem, just sets you apart from the crowd. So my neologism is neobehaviorism. And the way it works, well, I'm going to give you 3 examples of the way it works. So one neo-behaviorist idea comes from a guy who's spoken here, I think, recently. You guys have had Charles Duhigg in recently. So he's got a super book, brilliant book, practical book, lots of insights. I won't try and comment on his, overall an excellent contribution. So there's some 3 things about habits change. His book's called The Power of Habit that we need to know. And these are super practical. So one is motivation isn't your friend. So we all think in order to change our habits, we need to motivate. Motivation is like this. Motivation is related to arousal of the sympathetic nervous system. Yeah, so that's one thing. Our state of how much excitement we feel. No, not that kind of arousal. No, not that. No, the other kind of arousal that physiologists talk about. And it's also related to the narratives we have, which change. Yeah, so our level of arousal and the narratives they produce our motivation. Well, that's up and down. Some days you're feeling it, and some days you're not. So when you have a habit, habits tend to transcend motivation. And so the very powerful idea in books like The Power of Habit is once you get the habit, your motivation can do what it likes, but you have the habit. So that's one thing. And there are 2 really super duper practical tips. One is mini habits. And I think this is a fascinating idea. So if you start really, really small, what does your intuition tell you if you meditated, say, 5 minutes a day for 6 days consecutively, or you meditated 1 day for 30 minutes? Which is better? What does your intuition tell you? Every day. How come? Because you're building a habit. Yeah. And after 30 or 45 or 60 repetitions, roughly speaking, it'll be ingrained. And, I know people, a guy who's been meditating for 20 years. This guy cannot go to bed without meditating. He just can't. It's for like brushing his teeth. It's like feels weird to him. And so once you have a habit like that, your motivation may fluctuate as it will, but you have a habit. So mini habits is an excellent way to get yourself in the game. The second way is a 30-day challenge. And this is something that's really, really fun to do in your own lives, in your personal lives, in your professional lives, is take on a 30-day challenge. So I use an example from my experience as a parent. So if I said to my son, I want you to do 30 minutes extra math until you finish high school, which is 6 more years, right? He'd look at me as if I was from Mars, and it would be a fight every single day. But we set a challenge in April. We said, look, you want to do really well on this test in May? Here's the deal. Let's do a 30-day challenge. Do 30 minutes on Khan Academy every day for 30 days, and then you're done. You know what? He doesn't suffer about it at all. He comes straight home, he throws down his bag, he does 30 minutes Khan, he gets on with his life. We're done with 30 days, and you know what he said? I'd like to do another 30-day challenge. And this one, he's going to write for 15 minutes a day. He has a certain amount of talent in creative writing. So a 30-day challenge is long enough so you begin to get the habit, but it's short enough so it doesn't feel like a life sentence, right? It doesn't feel like, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. How am I possibly going to manage, right? So those are really 2, I think, super duper practical things that we can think about when we want to change habit. So there's 2 more things in the area of neo-behaviorism that we can think about when we change behaviors in the 21st century. One is called choice architecture. Has anybody read a book called Nudge? Anybody? 1, 2, 3, 4, half a dozen of you. That's tremendous. I think it's one of the most important books I think it's been written in the last 15 or 20 years. And I think its power has not even begun to be tapped. So Thaler and Sunstein wrote a book called Nudge. And they are employed, in fact, the UK government has actually got a nudge team. I think they call it the Behavioral Insights Team, using what I'm about to describe in public policy, which is evidence-based public policy. So making public policy in accord with what the science would tell us, which is a strange thing, strange thing, especially living in the time we do, because public policy is determined by what? ideology, politics, dogmatism, habit, ritual, whatever you want. Certainly not rational, right? Certainly not evidence-based. So this book, the Behavioral Insights team, are really working hard to create evidence-based changes in public policy based on this idea of nudge. So what's the idea of nudge? The idea of nudge is you can shape people's behaviors by changing the environment. Okay, that's not super duper radical. Shape their behaviors by changing the environment, but the great thing about it is you leave them at liberty to choose. So in a sense, it's not coercive. It's certainly not as coercive as rewards and sanctions. Punish them if they do it and reward them if they do the opposite, right? It's not that coercive. So here's an example. If I'm a school cafeteria manager and I want the children to eat in a more healthy way, I can put, research shows, the healthy food at eye level, or I could put it early in the line. So by the time they get to the Doritos and the pizzas down here and the Coca-Colas, they got a full tray. So that makes sense, right? And research shows that's what they do. They pick the stuff that's eye level and early on the line. So I can array the choices, the choice architecture it's called, of the lunch line, either so they eat more healthily, but how else could I arrange those choices? So I make more money, so I could do the high margin stuff up front, the Doritos and the Coca-Cola and the pizzas and the processed food. I could do the older food that's about to expire, like they do in supermarkets, they put the old stuff at the front. But one of the things I can do using choice architecture is promote healthy choices, but the kids can still have as much pizza and Doritos as they want, but I'm making it easier for them to make the right choices. So that's choice architecture in a nutshell, is changing the environment. And there have been lots of experiments done in various spheres in it. I still think it hasn't reached deeply into the organization development, change management, organizational behavior world. I just don't think organizational change practitioners who do what I do for a living are paying enough attention to some of these ideas. And perhaps we are here. I mean, perhaps it'll be an interesting conversation here. So some of the things they've done is most people save far too little. So even when there's free money on the table, like an employer contributes to your 401k, they match the contribution or some percentage of the contribution, people leave that money on the table. They don't take up this 401k option. So one of the interesting experiments, and again, the wonderful thing about this is you can measure results. They ran an education program for this side of the room on savings, the virtue of savings. They had a financial wizard, wise guy up there telling people they ought to save more. And 401k enrollments went up 7%. Now on this side of the room, they used choice architecture, which is basically arraying the choices in a way that was pro-savings, if you will, 100% increase. So here is education trying to change hearts and minds and hoping that behavior follows. And here is choice architecture. And so one of the other striking examples for this is organ donation. So some places in the world, they have like 95% organ donation, like Austria, right? You know why? You know why? You have to opt out. You're an organ donor unless you say you don't want to. Ooh, that's too gross, right? But in the United States, mostly you have to opt in. Now, some states have switched from opt-in to opt-out. You know what happens? It goes from like 10% to 90%. That's choice architecture at work, because you can change the default settings. So those are some ideas, and I think, again, these are things that we're still learning how to do. This book only came out in, well, I think Nudge came out in 2009 or 2011, so it's a relatively recent idea, and it's gaining a lot of popularity, I think, thankfully, in the right circles. And so the very last idea on behavioral change that I'll close with is called behavioral specificity. So we think about resistance to change in a really weird way. It's a concept that is all throughout the organization development change management literature, is resistance to change. And so the way I was taught it when I went through this huge investment in my education as a change guy in 1995, is that resistance to change was either they objected to the rationality of the proposal, so they thought it was a bad idea intellectually, it's possible, or they had some emotional response. So they were afraid, they were angry, they were threatened in some way. So that's entirely too narrow a way to look at resistance to change. So we've already talked about one way that people resist change is because it's habit. It's not that they don't want to. It's not that they don't think it's a good idea. It's not that they're not motivated. They have habits to do otherwise. But we don't think about resistance to change enough in the organization development, the change management community, is how do I change people's habits? And that's really the way we want to think. When we work in culture, We think of culture, I'm going to be super controversial here, as the words that comes out of people's mouth, and that is really, really the tip of the culture iceberg. Because you know what? There's not a lot of correspondence between what comes out of people's mouth and the behaviors they actually follow. Do you know, if you ask me what my values are, I sound like a Boy Scout. Yeah? Really? Do I live like that? No, absolutely not. I don't do anything like horribly immoral or anything. I just want to hasten to add, but it's not like a life full of integrity and vitality, honesty and thrifty and service. I mean, I would love it if it were, but it's not. You know, I'm very human in design. But if you do values surveys in organizations, we frequently try and change culture in organizations through changing what comes out of people's mouths. And we do spend a lot of money. There's a huge industry. It's probably $1 billion industry, I think, assessing culture in organizations. I think it's a waste of money because you're assessing what comes out of people's mouths, and then to change it, then you try and change what comes out of people's mouths. And I just don't think, so if you look at culture as a collection of habits, as a collection of rituals, everything from the way we conduct meetings to the way we respond to emails. If you look at things like that, culture is a collection of behaviors, well, then there's something tangible and meaningful that you can change. And so I think the culture change industry needs a little shaken up. And so hopefully that's not too offensive to, I hope there's no one who makes their living doing culture surveys in the room. So those are two ideas on, I think, the way we need to think more about behaviors in organizations. And when I've seen change fail, it's inevitably because people didn't spend enough time thinking about the behaviors that were going to make the change go. They didn't spend enough time helping the users use the system, helping the people in a restructured organization, helping them behave differently, which is what really matters. And so, you know, my career, my early change management career was peppered with examples of trying to go in and try and change behavior in organizations and finding often that we'd been called in too late, and that people were already leaving in droves, and that they were trying to restructure an organization without thinking at all about changing behaviors or changing people's minds or changing people's cultures. So it's with all of this stuff on behavioral change, I want to speak with a certain amount of humility. You know, if someone says, oh, you're an expert in change, I almost blush or cringe inside, because I don't think, you know, our idea about what an expert isn't someone who's skeptical or humble or much of a learner. We think of an expert as a guy, like the answer guy. And I certainly, in the world of behavioral change, don't want to present myself as an answer guy, just because I think in the 21st century, the answers haven't been found. But there are some encouraging things. And I think we need to focus more on behaviors and less on hearts and minds. Now, people say, that sounds super duper callous. I don't mean it to be callous. What people feel and what they think has value in its own right. Not just because it's a way to get them to do what you want. So I think there is a place for engagement and for hearts and minds, and for having people in organizations committed to the mission and rationally committed to the business case of the organization. But I think that's a value in its own right. And I think we can change behaviors in a way we need to involve them, for sure, in changing hearts and minds, but we can't assume ever that behaviors will necessarily follow. So I've painted, I hope, something of an optimistic picture at the end. I mean, we're learning a great deal about behavioral change in the 21st century. And I think if we're going to create the kind of corporations, the kind of businesses that I'd like to see, I think the kind of businesses that Microsoft would like to become, communities where people come together to do magical things that they couldn't do by themselves, places where we can scale science and technology for the benefit of humankind, 7.4 billion people on the planet, places where we nurture relationships and where nature grow, and where structures that don't have people fighting for resources politically with one another. If we can structure organizations and decisions in organization around evidence, it would be a wonderful thing. And if we started to work on more things that valued, you know, human beings and organizations, you want people to engage with their work and to find meaning in their work. Well, have them do stuff that values. And I submit, you know, this is perhaps too judgmental a thing to say, but, you know, spending thousands of people trying to launch the 200th kind of toothpaste in the world is frittering away of the amazing capability that human beings have in the world, their imagination, their intellect, their creativity, their ability to work together to create. We've done amazing things, you know. The pyramids were built, how long ago were they built? 3,000 years ago or something like that. That's a long time. What are we doing today that looks like a pyramid? What are we doing today that looks like Notre Dame Cathedral? Because those were monuments to the maximum of what we could achieve with art and science and architecture in the time. What are the cathedrals that we're building today? You know, what are the important projects that are going to dignify us in 200, 300, and 500 years? People are going to look back and say, look what those guys did. It's an extraordinary thing. And so I'd like business to spend more time thinking about that and a lot less time thinking about the thousands of different kinds of toothpaste, which I'm not sure we need. So anyway, thank you. Thank you for your patience and grace.